Leo knew the anatomy of fear the way a doctor knew bone. It lived in the hollow of his stomach, a cold, knotted thing that tightened whenever he saw the iron gates of Northwood Elementary. It was a constant companion on his walk home, a shadow that stretched longer and darker than his own, even on the sunniest of days. But there were no sunny days anymore. The sky had been a sheet of slate gray for weeks, a perfect mirror for the world he inhabited. He was 10 years old, with eyes that had seen too much and a silence that had learned to say even more. His shoulders, small and thin beneath a threadbare jacket, were permanently hunched, a posture of constant apology for the space he occupied in the world. He learned to make himself small, to walk close to the walls of buildings, to blend in with the cracks in the pavement. It never worked. The route from school to the small apartment above the laundromat was a map of terror. He could not take the direct path down Maple Avenue, that was their territory. Their leader, Marcus, with his father's sneering smile and the cruel confidence that came with money, held court by the old candy shop. So Leo took the long way, a winding path through alleys that smelled of sour garbage and damp concrete, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Each scuttling rat, each gust of wind rattling a loose piece of tin, was them. Coming for him. The bruises were the worst part. They were a secret atlas of his pain, mapped across his arms and ribs in ugly shades of purple and blue. The latest one, a dark bloom on his forearm, was from yesterday. Marcus had twisted his arm behind his back while his friends, Kyle and Josh, emptied his backpack, scattering his worn textbooks and a half-eaten apple onto the grimy asphalt. They had laughed, a sound like broken glass, as he scrambled to pick up his things. "See you tomorrow, mud boy," Marcus had hissed, his breath hot and foul. He had tried to tell. He told his teacher, Mr. Abernathy, who had sighed a weary sigh and promised to "look into it," a phrase Leo had come to understand meant, do nothing. His mother, Sarah, had called the principal, Mr. Thompson, twice. The first time, she was told Marcus was just being a boy, and that Leo was perhaps too sensitive. The second time, after they had cornered him in the lavatory and held his head under the running faucet, her call was not returned. Marcus's father was a town councilman, a man who donated generously to the school's athletic fund. Leo learned early that some people's words were louder than others, and his mother's were whispers in a hurricane. His mother. Sarah was a fortress of love, but even fortresses could be worn down by siege. She worked 2 jobs, a day shift cleaning rooms at the sterile downtown hotel and an evening shift waitressing at the Greasy Spoon, the diner she and his father had dreamed of owning before he was taken from them by a sickness that stole his breath and their savings. Now, she was both mother and father, a warrior armed with a coffee pot and a tired smile. When she came home, her bones ached with a weariness so profound it seemed to seep into the very walls of their small apartment. She would hug Leo, her love a fierce, desperate thing, but her eyes were clouded with exhaustion. He couldn't bear to add the weight of his own misery to her already stooped shoulders. So he hid the bruises under long sleeves and answered, "Fine," when she asked about his day. The lie was a stone in his throat, but it was a stone he would swallow for her. The diner was their only other home. It was a relic from a different time, a long, narrow car of chrome and red vinyl, now dulled by decades of grease and faded dreams. The neon sign outside sputtered, the S in spoon having given up the ghost years ago, so it read, "The Greasy Poon." Most nights, Leo would sit in the last booth, doing his homework under the flickering fluorescent lights, the smell of frying onions and stale coffee a familiar comfort. He would watch his mother move between tables, a phantom of grace and efficiency, and his heart would ache with a love so large it felt like another bruise. It was on a Tuesday, with rain lashing against the plate glass windows, that the bell above the door chimed a different kind of tune. It wasn't the gentle jingle of a regular or the hurried clang of a truck driver. This was a heavy, resonant sound, as if the door itself had been shoved open with contemptuous force. 4 men filled the doorway. They were giants, clad in worn leather vests that were a collage of patches, skulls, eagles, and words that Leo couldn't read. They blocked out the fading light, their presence sucking the air from the small diner. The few customers hunched lower over their meals. Sarah froze mid-stride, the coffee pot in her hands suddenly looking like a child's toy. They moved with a rumbling swagger, their boots heavy on the checkered linoleum. 3 of them took a booth, their large frames spilling out of the seats. The 4th, a man whose sheer size seemed to bend the light around him, walked to the counter. He had a long, graying beard braided into 2 thick ropes, and his face was a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights. A long, faded scar cut a path from his left eyebrow to his jaw. He swung a leg over a stool near the end, right next to Leo's booth, and the worn vinyl groaned in protest. Sarah approached him, her movements stiff. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice a little too high. The man's eyes, a startlingly pale blue, scanned the room before settling on her. They were not unkind eyes, Leo thought, just old. They looked like they had seen everything. "Coffee," he grunted, his voice a low rumble, like gravel being poured into a deep hole. "Black," Sarah nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. The man watched her, then his gaze drifted and found Leo, who was trying to shrink into the cracked vinyl of his booth, his math book a flimsy shield. The biker didn't smile. He just looked, his expression unreadable. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. This was a different kind of fear. Not the sharp, panicked fear Marcus inspired, but a deep, primal awe, the kind you felt standing at the edge of a cliff. The man took a slow sip of his coffee. He made a sound of satisfaction and then turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on Leo's forearm, which was resting on the table. The sleeve of his jacket had ridden up, exposing the edge of the dark purple bruise Marcus had given him. It was an ugly, angry mark against his brown skin. Leo snatched his arm back, pulling the sleeve down, his face burning with shame. He expected the man to laugh, or sneer, or simply ignore it. But he did none of those things. He just kept looking at Leo, his pale eyes narrowed in concentration. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the hiss of the grill and the drumming of the rain. "That's a nasty-looking souvenir you got there, kid," the biker said, his voice still a low rumble, but softer now. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact. Leo didn't answer. He stared down at his book, at the nonsensical numbers that swam before his eyes. He could feel his mother's worried gaze from across the room. He could feel the eyes of the other 3 bikers, who had stopped their quiet conversation to watch. "An accident?" the man asked. Leo shook his head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. The lump in his throat was back, bigger than ever. He felt tears pricking at his eyes and fought them back fiercely. He would not cry. Not here. Not in front of this man. The biker took another sip of coffee. He set the mug down with a soft click. He seemed to be thinking, studying the small, hunched boy in the booth. There was a world of pain in that posture, a story of defeat in the way his eyes never lifted from the table. The man had seen that look before, in the eyes of young soldiers and broken men. He had not expected to see it in a diner, in the eyes of a child. "My grandma," Leo whispered, the words surprising even himself. They were small and shaky, but they were there, hanging in the air between them. "My grandma says, when you can help, you help. And when you can't, you ask for it." The biker was silent for a long moment. He looked at the boy, then at the weary woman behind the counter who was watching her son with a heartbreaking mix of love and fear. He saw the whole story. The unpaid bills tucked behind the cash register, the faded photographs on the wall of a happier time, the quiet desperation that clung to the air like the smell of grease. Then, something inside Leo broke. It was the dam of silence he had so carefully constructed. It was the wall of pretense he built every single day. He didn't know why he was doing it. Maybe it was the quiet intensity in the man's eyes. Maybe it was the memory of his grandmother's words. Or maybe he was just so tired of being afraid. He slowly, deliberately, pushed up the sleeve of his other arm. There were more bruises there. A constellation of them. Some were fading to a sickly yellow, others were a fresh, violent purple. Without a word, he unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his shirt and pulled the collar aside, revealing a particularly dark mark on his collarbone where he'd been shoved against a locker. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The bruises spoke for him. They screamed a story of relentless cruelty, of institutional failure, of a child's lonely war. A profound stillness fell over the big man. His massive shoulders, which had been relaxed, went rigid. The hand holding the coffee mug was perfectly still. His pale blue eyes were fixed on the marks, and in their depths, a cold fire began to burn. It was a terrifyingly calm fury, more menacing than any shout could ever be. He looked from the bruises on the boy's skin to the boy's face, at the single tear that had finally escaped and was tracing a silent path down his cheek. He didn't finish his coffee. He pushed the half-full mug away. He reached into his vest, pulled out a thick, worn leather wallet, and dropped a crisp $100 bill onto the counter. It was more than enough to pay for all 4 of them, with plenty left over. He stood up, his stool scraping loudly against the floor. "What's your name, kid?" he asked, his voice now hard as granite. "Leo," the boy whispered. The man nodded once. He looked at Sarah, who was staring, her face pale with shock and a dawning, terrified hope. He gave her a look that was both a reassurance and a promise. Then he turned and walked toward the door, his 3 companions rising in unison to follow him. He paused at the door, turning back to look directly at Leo. "You did the right thing, Leo," he said. And then they were gone, the bell chiming their departure, leaving behind a stunned silence and a $100 bill on the counter. The next week was the longest of Leo's life. A sliver of hope had been planted in his chest that day, but it was a fragile, tentative thing, easily choked by the weeds of his reality. The biker had not said he would be back. He had not said he would do anything. He had simply seen, and then he had left. As the days ticked by, Leo began to believe he had been foolish. He had shown his weakness to a stranger, a dangerous-looking man who was probably miles away by now, the memory of a small, bruised boy already faded from his mind. His fear grew, and with it, the bullies' cruelty. They must have sensed his desperation, his last-ditch plea to an unknown power. They took it as a challenge. Marcus and his crew were relentless. They accidentally tripped him in the hallway, sending his lunch tray flying. They stole his hat during recess and played keep away until the bell rang, tossing it into a puddle just before he could get it back. The taunts grew sharper, the shoves harder. "Who you gonna tell now, mud boy?" Marcus would sneer. "Gonna cry to your mommy again?" Leo retreated further into himself. The world became a muffled, gray place, seen through a haze of anxiety. He stopped raising his hand in class. He ate his lunch in a deserted corner of the library. He walked home with his head down, praying for invisibility. The bruises he had shown the biker were fading, but new ones were taking their place. He felt utterly, completely alone. His one act of courage felt like a final, devastating mistake. Sarah saw the change. She saw the new shadows under his eyes, the way he flinched at sudden noises. Her heart broke a little more each day. She tried to talk to him, but his answers were monosyllabic walls she couldn't breach. She felt a rising tide of helpless anger, at the school, at the bullies, at a world that could be so cruel to someone so good. She felt like she was failing him, and it was the heaviest burden of all. It was a Friday afternoon when it happened. A week and a half after the bikers had visited the diner. The sky was, as usual, the color of dirty dishwater. Leo was in his booth at the diner, staring at a blank page in his notebook, when the sound began. It was a low hum at first, so faint he thought it was just a truck on the distant highway. But it didn't fade. It grew. It was a vibration that he felt in the soles of his shoes before he truly heard it. The water in his glass began to tremble, creating tiny, concentric rings on its surface. The windows of the diner began to buzz softly in their frames. Sarah looked up from the grill, a frown on her face. What in the world is that? The hum deepened, swelling into a rumble, then a roar. It was not the sound of one engine, but of dozens, then scores, then hundreds. It was a deep, guttural thunder that seemed to be rolling down the street, shaking the very foundations of the old building. It was the sound of an approaching army. The few customers in the diner got up and went to the windows, their faces etched with confusion and alarm. Leo felt a strange stirring in his chest. A wild, impossible thought. He slid out of his booth and joined them at the window, peering out into the gray afternoon. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. They came over the crest of the hill at the end of Main Street, a vision of chrome and black leather. It wasn't 4 bikes. It was a river. A tidal wave of steel and thunder that poured into their small, forgotten town. There were 50, then 100, then 200. They just kept coming, an endless procession of motorcycles that filled the street from curb to curb. The noise was deafening, a magnificent, terrifying symphony of raw power that echoed off the brick storefronts and vibrated deep in Leo's bones. The town froze. People came out of their shops, shielding their eyes as if from a great light. Cars pulled over to the side of the road, their drivers staring in disbelief. Curtains twitched in the windows of the houses lining the street. The town's lone police officer, Officer Miller, stood by his cruiser, his mouth hanging open, his hand hovering uncertainly near his hip. This was not a gang. This was an occupation. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, their discipline absolute. They fanned out through the town square, surrounding it with a ring of iron and chrome. A large contingent, perhaps 50 bikes, peeled off and rumbled slowly, menacingly, past the opulent, manicured lawn of the town councilman. Another group continued down the street, their destination clear. They were heading for the school. At the head of the procession, riding a motorcycle that looked more like a beast of war than a machine, was the man with the braided beard and the pale blue eyes. He brought his bike to a halt directly in front of the greasy spoon. He swung his leg off, the engine dying with a final, throaty cough. One by one, in a staggered, deafening chorus, hundreds of engines fell silent. The sudden quiet was more shocking than the noise had been. The biker leader took off his helmet, his graying hair wild from the wind. He saw Leo standing in the window, his small face pressed against the glass, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. The man's hard face softened, and for the first time, he gave Leo a small, grim smile. It was a smile that said, "We're here." He walked to the door of the diner and came inside, the bell sounding small and insignificant in the wake of the thunder. He was followed by a dozen of his men, who arranged themselves silently along the wall, their presence turning the small diner into a command post. He walked to the counter and looked at Sarah, who was leaning against it for support, her face ashen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a calm rumble in the heavy silence. "We're here about your boy." The main force, a phalanx of nearly 200 bikers, had parked in a precise, intimidating formation in the school's parking lot. They sat on their silent bikes, a stoic army of leather and denim, their faces unreadable behind sunglasses and beards. They didn't move. They just waited. Their presence was a silent, overwhelming statement. The man Leo now knew as Bear led a small delegation of 5 of his largest men toward the school's front entrance. The final bell had just rung, and students who were pouring out of the doors froze in their tracks, their chatter and laughter dying instantly. They parted like the sea before Moses as Bear and his men walked through them, their heavy boots echoing on the pavement. Principal Thompson was in his office, talking on the phone, when his secretary burst in, her face pale. "Mr. Thompson," she stammered, there are men here to see you." Before Thompson could respond, the door to his office was filled by Bear's massive frame. He didn't knock. He simply entered, his men flanking him, their presence making the spacious office feel like a cramped closet. Thompson, a man used to wielding his petty authority with impunity, felt a cold knot of fear tighten in his stomach. He dropped the phone back into its cradle. "Can I help you?" he asked, trying to inject a measure of authority into his voice. It came out as a squeak. Bear didn't answer immediately. He let the silence hang in the air, a weapon in itself. His pale blue eyes swept over the office, taking in the polished desk, the self-important plaques on the wall, the look of panicked arrogance on the principal's face. "We're here to discuss the education of a student named Leo," Bear said finally, his voice dangerously soft. "It seems his curriculum has included lessons in pain, humiliation, and fear. We're here to inform you that those classes are now cancelled." "Permanently," Thompson sputtered, his face turning red. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is a school. If you have a complaint, you need to make an appointment." "We called," Bear interrupted, stepping closer to the desk. He leaned forward, placing his huge, scarred hands flat on the polished wood. Thompson flinched back as if he'd been struck. "Leo's mother called you. Twice. On October 17th, and again on October 25th. You dismissed her. You did nothing. Your inaction has a price. Today is the day you pay it." Bear's voice never rose, but its intensity was terrifying. He laid out the facts with cold precision, the names, the dates, the specific acts of cruelty. He knew everything. It was clear he had done his homework. "Get me Marcus Thorne, Kyle Bishop, and Josh Miller," Bear commanded. "And get their parents on the phone. Tell them to get down to this school immediately. Tell them it's a matter of their son's continued well-being." 20 minutes later, the three boys stood in the principal's office, their usual swagger gone, replaced by a pasty-faced fear. Their parents arrived shortly after, blustering and indignant. Marcus's father, the councilman, strode in, his face a mask of fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, pointing a finger at Bear. "Who the hell are you to summon me here? I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Bear didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on Marcus. "Is this your boy?" he asked the councilman, his voice flat. He then turned his chilling gaze on Marcus. "Did you twist a little boy's arm behind his back? Did you call him mud boy?" Marcus wilted under the intensity of that stare, all his bravado evaporating. He looked to his father for help, but for the first time, his father's power was useless. The councilman opened his mouth to protest, but one of Bear's men took a single, deliberate step forward, and the words died in his throat. Bear addressed the parents, his voice now carrying the weight of a judge passing sentence. "Your sons are bullies. And you are failures as parents. You have raised cowards who find pleasure in the pain of a child who has nothing. That ends. Today." He leaned back from the desk. "Here is what is going to happen. Your boys are going to publicly apologize to Leo. Then, you are going to pay for him to have counseling, to undo the damage you've allowed to happen. And you," he said, his eyes landing on the councilman, "are going to personally fund a new, robust anti-bullying program for this entire school district. And if I ever hear that any of you, or your pathetic sons, has so much as looked at Leo the wrong way again," he let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but perfectly understood. "We are his family now," Bear stated, a simple, undeniable fact. "We protect our own. And an injury to him is an injury to every single one of us waiting outside. Do you understand?" The parents, stripped of their power and privilege, could only nod, their faces a mixture of fear and humiliation. The war was over. Leo had won. The transformation was immediate and profound. The bikers did not just leave. They stayed. Not all of them, but a rotating guard of a dozen men set up a temporary chapter in a rented warehouse on the edge of town. They paid Sarah's rent for 2 years, giving her enough breathing room to quit her hotel job and focus on the diner. They descended on the Greasy Spoon one weekend, a swarm of leather-clad carpenters, plumbers, and electricians. They fixed the sputtering sign, replaced the cracked vinyl in the booths, and installed a brand new grill. They didn't just save the diner, they resurrected it. Leo's life changed in ways he could never have imagined. Every morning, a different biker would arrive at his apartment to walk him to school. He would walk beside a giant of a man, chatting about homework or comic books, while the other children stared in open-mouthed awe. The bullies, now pariahs in their own school, avoided him like the plague. The fear that had been his constant companion for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. He started raising his hand in class again. He made friends. He laughed, a sound that had become foreign to him, and it was the sweetest music Sarah had ever heard. The town changed, too. The initial fear of the bikers slowly morphed into respect, and then into a strange, communal pride. The men were unfailingly polite, spending their money in local shops, helping an old woman carry her groceries, even volunteering to help rebuild the roof on the local church. They were the town's resident guardian angels, their intimidating appearance a shield for the community's most vulnerable. Months later, when it was clear the lesson had been learned and the peace would hold, the main body of the club prepared to leave. They gathered one last time in front of the diner. Bear found Leo sitting in his usual booth, sketching in a notebook. "We're heading out, kid," Bear said, his voice a soft rumble. Leo looked up, his eyes clear and bright. There were no more shadows there. "Will I see you again?" he asked. Bear placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Courage isn't about not being afraid, Leo. It's about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. You showed us what courage looks like. You don't need us anymore. But we'll always be here if you do." He pressed a small, folded piece of paper into Leo's hand. It was a phone number. "For family," Bear said. Leo walked outside and stood with his mother, watching as the engines roared to life once more. The sound was no longer terrifying. It was the sound of hope. It was the sound of protection. It was the sound of a debt, repaid 1,000 times over. Bear gave him a final, solemn nod, and then he led his army out of town, a river of steel and honor flowing back out onto the highway, leaving behind one small boy and his mother, safe and whole, under a sky that was finally beginning to turn blue.